G'day, legends, and I want to have a pretty serious conversation here based around women's MMA. Okay, so I know just straight off the bat, there is going to be a lot of journalists out there, maybe people like Luke Thomas, that are going to get very, very defensive whenever you bring up any criticism over WMMA. But I do think that much like the discussions that were happening around 2016, 2017 about the men's flyweight division and whether or not that was still viable entertainment, a piece of entertainment for a company like the UFC, I do think we do need to talk about women's MMA and how it is on a downward trajectory and has been for quite some time, and maybe provide some solutions to the problem. So if we could have a honest discussion about this, that would be quite good. Look, there was a time where women's MMA did have some characters, it did have some entertainment, right? But unfortunately today, that does seem to have fallen off. Look, the UFC, it's a sports entertainment company, and like any entertainment company, it has contracts. Contracts with ESPN, which is owned by Disney, and that is to put out a certain amount of fights every single year. And this is why the UFC was flourishing during 2020 above every other sport. When all the other sports were canceled, Dana White said, I am not going to be paying whatever ungodly fine it is that is connected to not being able to put on that many sports, and instead decided that he would start to look for somewhere to do it. In steps Abu Dhabi, in steps Yas Island, UFC Fight Island is born, the content creation machine can continue on. Now, in a world like that, where the demand for content is so high, it is not exactly like you could just go ahead and cut 3 divisions from the UFC, or even go back to considering cutting the entire flyweight division. The UFC is no longer this tight machine that is there to put on the best product it can. The UFC is now a brand that is there to put on as many fights as possible to fulfill TV contracts. And it does feel like now, today in 2024, the entirety of women's MMA is suffering, particularly from that point. So why do I believe that? Why do I think that is the case? Well, I think that's purely because of just how young the sport is, right? And I mean women's MMA. It was only introduced to us, the UFC, about a decade ago. Now that's hardly enough time for young girls around the world to go and watch the sport on television and then decide that they want to become these amazing fighters and get their asses into a gym. We are only just starting to see those kind of results in men's MMA now with the Raul Rosas Jr.-esque fighters, the Sean O'Malley-esque fighters. Secondly, it's also the landscape of investment into this sport or women's MMA is very, very different than it was in 2011. Look, when it was being put onto the scene, it really needed to stand on its own legs. The UFC was a brand still growing itself and marketing itself, and it was making sure that it was still putting on the best entertainment product it could to continue to sell itself forward to try and get on slots like ESPN. That's very different now to how it is in 2024 now that it has those contracts. And therefore, because back then it was still trying to prove itself, you were getting deals done with established talent. Talent like, obviously, Ronda Rousey, an Olympic judoka. There was Gina Carano, who was the face of women's MMA in a completely separate organization at the time. There was Holly Holm, a world kickboxing champion, already a well-established name. Misha Tate, again, a former champion from a different league. Michelle Waterson-Gomez, a former champion from a different league. Chris Cyborg, former champion from a different league. And they were getting paid fairly decent contracts to come over to the UFC and help it grow. You had instant, well-established talent already come into the MMA's top promotion, the best organization in the sport, the UFC. Nowadays, we have a lot of women coming to the UFC straight off the Contender Series or off Tough or off regional MMA. They are coming in to the premier product of the UFC, not off the back of their own sports, but when they're still trying to do some growth. And this does mean that by default, if you're bringing in women at the top of their own leagues into the UFC, whereas nowadays you're bringing in women into the UFC and they still have growth to do, therefore by default, the talent pool, the level of skill is going to be less because these new women now need to catch up to what it used to be. That obviously means that you have a drop in quality when it comes to the actual fights themselves. Then, of course, there are the storylines. Where are your cyborgs? Where are your Ronda Rouseys? Where are your Caranos? These women were more bombastic and they drew a lot of attention to themselves. And it seems like women's MMA has sort of lost that. Now that I think is what has happened is women feel like their place in the sport is already set in stone. and therefore there is less of a I am trying to prove myself. I'm trying to prove that I am meant to be here. You've got women that are now in the sport, coming in young, that are here to prove their skills in a sport or a league or a division in the UFC that is already well established. Whereas in 2011 and so on up to say 2017, you had women coming into the sport and there was still a conversation going on of whether or not women's MMA should even exist, whether or not women's MMA should even be in the UFC. You know, this is freshly coming off the back of Dana White saying, I promise you, we are never going to have women in the UFC. So obviously those women that were coming into the sport in that generation needed to prove that they deserved to be here and therefore had bigger, louder, more bombastic personalities. Whereas the girls now, they don't seem to have that. So now you've got a drop-off in quality as these new women are starting to hone their skills in the premier organization, plus a drop-off in entertainment as those same women feel like they're already coming into a well-established league that deserves to be here. They no longer need to sell themselves as much as when you are launching a new product. And then the next problem with women's MMA at the moment is look at the championship picture itself, right? Right now you've got Juliana Pena, an old veteran who has been insanely inactive. When you look at the amount of fights that she has versus the amount of years that she has been in the sport, not an active champion at all. Calling out an ex-GOAT who has been retired now for a number of years to do a third fight that happened a couple of years ago. This goes to show that the division hasn't moved on at all in 3 years. We're still trying to chase the tail of where we were 3 years ago. You've got Valentina Shevchenko, who has become a champion again. She's now a on-again, off-again champion who has been there again for 5 years. Where is the growth in the division? And let's face it, with Valentina having to stay dominant and having to stay where she is at her age, she does need to lean more into the wrestling style. Glover Teixeira was always a great grappler, but he did the same thing. He leaned into a wrestling style. RDA, as you get older, you lean into a wrestling style. Bloody Gilbert Burns, as you get older, you lean into a wrestling style. It's the smart thing to do as you age up. Valentina is following a well-established playbook, but that does lead to less entertaining fights and does go to show that we are now looking at our second division. You got Juliana Pena calling out Amanda Nunes. Not much growth there in 3 years. Valentina Shevchenko being a champion for the best part of 5 years. Not much growth there. And then the next one up is Weili Zhang. Where is she? What is going on with Weili Zhang? Let me drop some names for you. Alexander Volkanovski, Israel Adesanya, Kamaru Usman, Alex Pereira, early Khamzat Chimaev, early Kevin Holland. What do these guys all have in common? Activity. Nothing gets the fans more interested than activity. And not being a massive name means that you need to have as much activity as possible to get yourself in front of the fans to maybe perhaps become a bigger name. Amanda Nunes, when she first challenged Ronda Rousey for the belt, literally got no promotion. Like, you wouldn't even know that Ronda Rousey was fighting anyone else. You would have thought that that would have just been the comeback of Ronda Rousey. I think it was like UFC 217 or something like that. I can't remember it. But back in the day, when it was Ronda Rousey versus Amanda Nunes, you honestly would not have known that Amanda Nunes was even in that fight, the lack of promotion that she was getting. But over time, with her consistent activity and how often we saw her face, the fans grew to love her and she grew to become one of us. Weili Zhang, where are you? What is going on? I can understand not fighting twice in a year, but the fact that she hasn't even got her next fight announced, the fact that she fought in April and we do not know when her next fight is unacceptable from a champion. We should at least know. With Leon Edwards, we knew that he was going to be fighting in Manchester, right? With Dricus du Plessis, we knew that he was either going to be fighting in Australia or South Africa. We knew that they were being held up for something. Ilia Topuria, we all assumed he was being held up for Spain. We just booked a fight night in China, and Weili is not available. What is going on? So, today, the state of women's MMA is you've got no new big names being brought in from other organizations, apart from obviously the elephant in the room, Kayla Harrison, but her performance at UFC 307 was not exactly a dominant showstopper. We were promised something big, and it was a pretty flat performance. And that is the biggest piece of talent that we have brought into women's MMA in the last 5 years. Paired with championship pictures that do not seem to be moving or are inactive, there has been no growth for the last, you could say, 5 years, with Shevchenko winning her belt back. All on top of that, sitting on top of a league that is coming in from the Contender Series and still honing their skills. Women's MMA at this point is at the lowest quality it has ever been in, the least entertaining it has ever been in since it has been introduced into the UFC. And while that talent does still need to grow, we all have to suffer watching it. So, and I mean suffer watching it because if it is still growing if these people are still honing their skills, then it's not that high level to watch, is it? It's not that entertaining. So what is the solution to this? Look, that we still need to fill the UFC TV deals, still need to fill the slots. I do not think that you are going to have all of women's MMA just completely taken out of the UFC. There is just too much content to fill. But you do, UFC, continue to put on garbage shows at the Apex. So why not try putting on women's only Apex cards and allow the talent to grow? And then once you have a couple of women, like a couple of women who can get a couple of highlights together, 3 highlights together that you can put a promotional package together for, then drop them into UFC arenas, fight night arenas. When we're doing fight nights at crowded arenas, drop them in there as co-main events, right? Standard UFC women's title fights, have them as main events of crowded arena fight nights. And then when we do get women's super fights that build up amongst the hardcores that enjoy it, your Juliana Pena, Amanda Nunes 3, your Weili Zhang versus Valentina Shevchenko. When we do have those women's super fights, chuck them on your pay-per-view product as a co-main event. That way you can give it the space it needs to grow rather than just shoving it in the middle of fight night cards and UFC pay-per-view cards willy bloody nilly, mate. I do think that is a viable solution that could be done, that could help grow women's MMA to try and bring it back to what it was in, say, 2017, 2016, when we had some characters and it was a little bit interesting. In the meantime, as for myself, look, we are busy people. We are very, very busy people. I'm a super busy person. A lot of people are, and that you just do not have that time dedicated to watching every single piece of entertainment. There is only so many things that you can do. And with so many great MMA products out there, like UFC pay-per-views or bare knuckle boxing, or my favorite, One Championship, or Eternal MMA, or Cage Warriors, there is only so much attention that you can devote to the sport. And when I'm watching UFC, I'm watching it from the comfort of my own home, plugged into a television, with a browser window open on UFC Fight Pass. I am going to be opening a second tab anytime there is a women's MMA fight on from now on, and just watching Friday fight nights from One Championship, just catching up on all the other MMA that has been going on around the world. I am going to be boycotting women's MMA, not in like a I hate it or like putting it down sort of way. I'm just completely indifferent to it, and I don't see any reason to invest my time into it. So I'm officially done with women's MMA. I'm not going to be watching it anymore. I'm going to sit down, watch an Apex Fight Night card live, every single one, every single pay-per-view, every single fight night. But when the women's fight nights come on, I'm just going to be opening a second tab and just watching something else, because it's not growing. Nothing's happening. There's no movement. There's no entertainment. And I'm sick of wasting my time looking at it. So there you go. That is what I think is a fair summation of the problem of women's MMA today. There is a solution that the UFC could implement to try and build it back up and generate some hype. The best thing to, like, what is that old saying? Like, distance makes the heart grow fonder. Pull away from it a little bit, allow it to grow on its own while still fulfilling your ESPN obligations, and then reintroduce it to us, the fans, on crowded fight nights and pay-per-views when there is a little bit of hype there. And for us, the fans, until there, what else are you meant to do? How are you meant to fix this problem? Fix it yourselves. Open up a second tab and watch something more interesting. There is bare knuckle, One Championship, Cage Warriors, and Eternal. There is so much goddamn MMA out there. It's insane. And don't waste your time watching something that isn't fun. That's it. Let me know what you think about that down there in the comments. I know this could get into a pretty controversial topic, but I tried to keep it pretty mature and keep it pretty serious. So let me know what you think about it down there. If this is your first time watching one of my videos, I try and make an MMA video every single day. So if you want to hit subscribe, you can always unsubscribe later if you end up not liking the content. If you're already on board with the channel, you know what to do. Hit that like button. And until then, I will see you all in the next video.